Picture this: a drawing room in late October, rain against the windows, a fire going low, and 30 people seated for what had been announced as a family gathering, the kind that, in houses like Thornfield Hall, meant something was about to be decided and everyone had been summoned to witness it. Theodora Vane had been in that room 100 times. She had grown up in it. She knew the precise sound the third floorboard made when you crossed from the Persian rug to the parquet, and the way the light fell through the west window at 4 in the afternoon and turned everything amber and slightly dishonest. She knew which chairs the older aunts preferred and which corner her father had always stood in when he had something important to say. She was not supposed to be there. She was supposed to be in the kitchen, where she had been for the past 6 weeks, under the name Dora Wells, employed as an assistant to the cook. She was supposed to be invisible. That had been the plan, and until 40 minutes ago, the plan had been working. But plans have a way of collapsing precisely when you most need them to hold, and Theodora had learned this particular lesson more than once. She stood now at the edge of the drawing room, still wearing the plain gray dress and the apron she had not had time to remove, and she listened to the Duke of Thornfield, her father's ward, the man who had inherited everything that should have come to her, stand in the center of the room and say, in a voice that carried to every corner, that he intended to formally contest the codicil her father had added to his will 3 months before his death. The codicil that left Thornfield Hall and its lands, along with the trust her grandmother had established, to Theodora Margaret Vane, the legitimate daughter of the late Duke of Thornfield, to be held in her name and administered at her discretion. Cassius Aldermere, the ward, the inheritor, the man who had lived at Thornfield for 12 years, and had apparently decided at some point that living in a house was the same as owning it, spoke with the easy confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment thoroughly and expected no serious resistance. He said, the codicil was irregular. He said her father had not been of sound mind in his final months. He said, and this was the part that caused the room to go very quiet, that the daughter had not been seen in 3 years, had made no effort to maintain her connection to the family estate, and that a woman of her particular circumstances was not equipped to manage an estate of Thornfield's complexity. Theodora heard the words from the doorway. She had come because one of the kitchen maids, a girl named Penny, who missed nothing, had seen the family solicitor's carriage arrive at 2:30 and had thought Dora Wells might want to know about it. Penny did not know who Dora Wells actually was. She had simply read the situation with the accuracy of someone who had spent her life paying attention to the movements of people with power, and had passed the information along with the matter-of-fact kindness of a person who does this without thinking about it. Theodora had come to listen. She had not intended to be seen. But here was the thing about a room you grew up in. You stopped paying attention to where you put your feet. The third floorboard announced her arrival with its characteristic sound, and 30 people turned to look at the woman in the apron standing in the doorway of the Thornfield drawing room. Cassius Aldermere looked at her. His expression for one unguarded moment was not what she had expected. It was not contempt. It was not dismissal. It was something more complicated. Recognition, rapidly suppressed, and beneath it, something she did not have a name for yet. Then his face settled into the polished composure she had seen him wear at 100 social occasions, and he said, quite pleasantly, "The kitchen staff do not generally attend family meetings." Theodora looked at him for a moment. She looked at the solicitor, old Mr. Fenchurch, who had drawn up her father's will and every document her family had produced for 30 years, and who was looking at her now with an expression that was not surprise. Then she looked at the room, the aunts, the cousins, the distant relations who had come for the spectacle of an inheritance contested, and the small, shameful hope that there might be something in it for them. She smoothed the front of her gray dress with one hand. She untied her apron and folded it, once, precisely, and set it on the side table near the door. "You're quite right," she said. "I apologize for the interruption. I'll wait for Mr. Fenchurch in the library." And she walked out, not quickly, not with any visible distress, at the pace of a woman who has somewhere else she'd rather be and knows the way. Behind her, the room took a moment to locate its voice. She heard it find it just as she reached the library door. The library at Thornfield Hall had always been her father's room. It smelled of leather and coal smoke and the particular dry paper smell of books that had been read many times by the same hands. When Theodora was 12, she had catalogued every volume on the north wall, shelf by shelf, in a notebook she had made from folded foolscap. She still knew where everything was. She sat down in the chair to the left of the fireplace, which had been her chair and not her father's, and she waited. Mr. Fenchurch came in 12 minutes later. He closed the door behind him. He set his leather bag on the desk with the care of a man who has been doing this for a very long time and has learned to be precise about his movements, because precision is a form of reliability, and reliability is the only currency that actually holds its value. He looked at her over his spectacles. "You are not," he said, "exactly who you've been presenting yourself as." "No," Theodora agreed. "Dora Wells has been employed in the Thornfield kitchen for 6 weeks. She has, and you have been gathering information." Theodora looked at the fire for a moment. "I've been understanding the situation, which required being present for it, which required not being immediately removed from the premises the moment I arrived, which would have happened if I had come as myself." She paused. "You would have done the same." Mr. Fenchurch sat down across from her. He was 71 years old and had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have heard a great many things and no longer feel the need to react to any of them immediately. He had been her father's solicitor for 25 years. He had been at her father's deathbed. He had been the one to write to Theodora in Edinburgh, where she had been living with her mother's sister for 3 years while the legal situation resolved itself, to tell her that her father was gone, and that the codicil existed, and that Cassius Aldermere was preparing to contest it. "Tell me what you know," he said. Theodora told him. It took 40 minutes. She told him about the accounts, the household records she had found in the kitchen ledgers, which were not where accounts of that kind usually lived, and which she had begun to understand, piece by piece, were there because someone had moved them from the study. She told him about the correspondence she had seen, not read. She had not read anyone's private letters, but had seen the volume and the regularity of between Aldermere and a firm of London solicitors she did not recognize. She told him about the tenant situation in the East Quarter, which was considerably worse than had been reported to the family, and about the drainage works that had been approved and funded 2 years ago, and which the groundskeeper, a taciturn man named Haskell, who had served her father for 15 years and clearly did not know who Dora Wells was, but had spoken to her with the unguarded honesty of someone who simply needed to tell somebody, had told her had never been completed. She told him all of it. Mr. Fenchurch listened with his hands folded, and his face arranged in the particular neutral attention of a man receiving testimony he intends to use. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You have been extraordinarily thorough," he said. "My father taught me to read a household," Theodora said. "He said it was more honest than reading a balance sheet. A balance sheet can be arranged. A household simply is." Mr. Fenchurch looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his leather bag and produced a folder that was considerably thicker than the one he had brought into the drawing room. "I was rather hoping," he said, "that you would say something like that." The confrontation, when it came, did not happen in the drawing room. Cassius Aldermere came to the library at 7 that evening after the relations had dispersed to their guest rooms, and the house had settled into its particular evening quiet, with the slightly different quality that Thornfield had when it was full of people who were not quite comfortable with each other. He knocked. Theodora said, "Come in." She was still sitting in the chair to the left of the fireplace. She had changed out of the gray dress and the kitchen apron. She was wearing dark green wool, her own clothes, brought in her trunk under the name of a woman who had not existed until 6 weeks ago, and who had served her purpose and could now be retired. Cassius Aldermere stood in the doorway of the library and looked at her. He was 35, which was 6 years older than Theodora. He had the kind of face that had been handsome since boyhood, and knew it not unpleasantly, but with the settled confidence of a person for whom good looks had always simply been one more advantage in a long list of them. Her father had taken him in at the age of 12, after his own father died in debt. He had been educated at Eton on the Thornfield estate's money. He had managed the estate for the past 8 years while the previous duke declined, slowly, and the daughter was away. He had done a great many things while the daughter was away. Theodora looked at him with the same attention she had been applying to everything for the past 6 weeks, which was to say, completely, without prior conclusions, waiting to see what was actually there. "You could have simply come home," he said. "You could have—" "I could have," Theodora agreed, "and been removed within a week while the legal situation was managed around me. Or I could come as someone with no stakes in the outcome and spend 6 weeks learning what the outcome actually involved." She paused. "I chose the second option." He was quiet for a moment. He moved into the room, not toward her, but to the window, which looked out over the east lawn. It was dark. The rain had stopped. In the reflected light from the room, she could see the grounds were in better order than she had expected. He had maintained the gardens, at least. She noted this without changing her assessment of anything else. "The codicil is valid," he said. "It was not a question. It is, Fenchurch told you. Fenchurch confirmed it. I had already established it myself through other means." She did not elaborate. "Your contest will not succeed. You know this, which is why you've been moving funds through the subsidiary accounts for the past 18 months, and why the London solicitors you've engaged are specialists in disputed inheritances rather than estate management." He turned from the window. Something shifted in his face, not guilt, exactly, or not only guilt. Something more complicated and less legible. He was quiet for long enough that the fire crackled twice and a coal shifted in the grate. "What do you intend to do?" he said. Theodora considered the question properly. She had been considering it in various forms for 3 years, since the letter from Edinburgh, since she had understood the full shape of what she had come back to, which was not simply an inheritance contested, but an estate that had been quietly, systematically administered by a man who had conflated living in a place with belonging to it. She had spent 6 weeks in the kitchen of her own house, cooking and cleaning and listening. She had mapped every account, every irregularity, every decision made in her name without her knowledge. She had talked to Haskell about the drainage works. She had talked to the housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Crosby, who had served the family for 20 years and who spoke to Dora Wells with the same careful guardedness she applied to everyone, and who had said, on one occasion, when she thought Dora Wells could not hear, that the old Duke's daughter had had better sense than anyone in this house since she left, and that it was a shame she wasn't here to see what had become of the place. Theodora had heard this from behind the kitchen door and had stood there for a moment before going on with what she was doing. "I intend to take possession of what is mine," she said. "I intend to address the tenant situation in the East Quarter before winter. I intend to complete the drainage works that were funded and not executed, and to have a full accounting of the subsidiary accounts from the past 3 years. She paused. I do not intend to pursue legal action against you, provided you cooperate with the transition completely and fully, and provided the accounting is accurate. Cassius Aldermere looked at her. You're letting me go. I am removing you from a position you were never entitled to hold, Theodora said. That is not the same as letting you go. You will leave Thornfield by the end of the month. You will provide every document Mr. Fenchurch requires. You will make no further contact with the London solicitors on any matter relating to the Thornfield estate. She looked at him steadily. In exchange for which, I will not spend the next 3 years unraveling every decision you made while I was absent and pursuing you through the courts for the portions of it that constitute mismanagement. Which I could do. Mr. Fenchurch has been quite thorough about what I could do. He said nothing for a long moment. Outside, the grounds were still and dark. Inside, the fire was warm and the north wall of the library held every book she had catalogued at the age of 12 still in their places, because whatever else Cassius Aldermere had done here, he had not moved the books. She noted this, too. Not as evidence of anything, just as a fact. You came back as a kitchen maid, he said finally. Not an accusation, something between observation and the beginning of something he hadn't worked out yet. I came back, Theodora said, in the only way available to me that would let me understand what I was coming back to. Yes. He was quiet again. She let him be quiet. She had learned, in 6 weeks in the Thornfield kitchen, that the instinct to fill silences was usually the enemy of real information. The East tenants, he said at last. There are 3 families. The Malloy family's roof has needed replacing since last spring. It was an odd thing to say. She looked at him. I know, he said. I know it needs doing. There wasn't. He stopped. It will be in the accounting. I wanted you to know it wasn't forgotten. Theodora looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. There was something in his face that she hadn't seen before, or perhaps had been seeing for 6 weeks, and hadn't correctly identified. Not guilt alone. Something that looked more like a man who had been trying to manage something too large for him, and had known it, and had made decisions he could not now quite defend, and was beginning to understand, in the particular way that coming to terms with things requires, that understanding does not undo them. She was not moved by this. She had used up her capacity for being moved by things she could not afford to feel in the first weeks after her father's death, when she had sat in her aunt's house in Edinburgh and read Mr. Fenchurch's letters and understood the full shape of what she had lost. What remained was something clearer and more useful, not hardness, just clarity. Tell Mr. Fenchurch about the roof, she said. Tonight, if possible. The Malloys should not spend another winter in it. He nodded. He moved toward the door. At the threshold he stopped, not looking back. I did not, he said, expect you to be this. Theodora did not ask what he meant. She thought she knew, and she did not require his assessment of it. Good night, she said. He left. The door closed with a sound that was not quite final but was close. She sat in the chair that had always been her chair. In the library that smelled of her father and old books and the particular coal smoke of a Thornfield winter. And she looked at the fire for a while. She did not feel triumph. She had anticipated triumph, in the abstract, in Edinburgh, in the various dark hours, when imagining it was the only way to make the next day manageable. What she felt instead was something quieter and more specific, like the particular satisfaction of a piece of furniture moved back to its correct place, like a room that has been wrong for a long time and has now been set right, like standing in a house that is yours, in the fullest sense, for the first time. She picked up the notebook on the side table, a new one, not the one from when she was 12, though she had found that one in the third drawer of the desk, and it was still perfectly legible, and she opened it to the page where she had been working. There was a great deal still to do. There was always a great deal still to do. But the list was hers, and the house was hers, and the fire was warm, and outside in the kitchen she could hear the faint sounds of Mrs. Crosby giving instructions to someone about the evening meal in the composed and authoritative voice of a woman who has managed this household for 20 years and intends to go on managing it for 20 more. Theodora put the pen to paper. She began to write. The month that followed was the hardest work she had done in her life, and she had spent 6 weeks as an assistant cook, so the comparison meant something. Mr. Fenchurch came every Tuesday. He came with his leather bag and his folders and his careful, precise accounting of everything that Thornfield had been doing and not doing for the past 3 years. And Theodora sat across the desk from him and read every page and asked every question, and did not let any of it go unexplained until she understood it completely. Not the simplified version. Everything. He had told her on the 3rd Tuesday that in 30 years of legal practice he had sat across from a great many clients. He had said it with the particular understatement of a man who was paying a compliment without quite being willing to call it that. She had thanked him and asked him to continue. The accounts were, as she had suspected, not a healthy picture. The subsidiary accounts were worse. The London solicitors had been engaged to explore avenues that, when examined in detail, turned out to be less about contesting the codicil and more about restructuring the estate's financial obligations in ways that would have made the codicil essentially meaningless in practice, even if valid in law. It was, Mr. Fenchurch said carefully, sophisticated. Theodora read every page of it. She did not feel anger. She had been angry in Edinburgh, in the small hours of many nights, with the specific and burning fury of a woman who has been managed and maneuvered and treated as a variable to be worked around rather than a person to be reckoned with. She had spent the anger. She had learned, in the spending of it, that anger was expensive and produced very little of value when applied to situations that required precision. What replaced it was something colder and more useful. She also visited the East Quarter. She went on a Thursday morning with Haskell, who walked her along the boundary line and showed her the drainage ditches that had been dug to half their required depth and then abandoned when the contractor had not been paid the second installment. He showed her the Malloy roof, which was worse than she had imagined from the account. He showed her 3 other properties in varying degrees of disrepair, and he did it with the compressed, careful manner of a man who has been watching this happen and has not had anyone to tell it to. She listened to all of it. She thanked him. She made notes. On the way back across the East Field, she asked him why he had talked to the kitchen maid about the drainage works. He was silent for a moment, and then he said that Dora Wells had asked the right questions in a way that suggested she understood what the answers meant. He had not known who Dora Wells was. He said this without accusation. Theodora told him. He was quiet for a long moment, walking. Then he said, without looking at her, that the old Duke would have appreciated the approach. He said it in the voice of someone who misses a person and finds small things to say about them when the real thing is too large. Theodora said nothing for a moment. Then she said, yes, she thought he probably would have. They walked back to the house in a silence that was not uncomfortable. The Malloy roof was replaced within the week. The contractor who came was from the village, not from London, which Haskell had suggested, and Theodora had agreed was the right approach. The drainage works were put out to tender properly. The first installment was paid on completion of the first phase, which was not how it had been done before, and which Theodora had decided was the correct way to do things going forward. She was busy every day. She was busier than she had been in Edinburgh, where the work had been the work of waiting and learning, and trying to understand a situation she could not yet affect. This was different. This was action, direct and specific, with results she could see. The East tenants' cottages were being repaired. The accounts were being brought into order. The London solicitors had been formally dismissed. Mr. Fenchurch was assembling the documentation that would make the codicil uncontestable. She was home, and the home was demanding everything she had, and she gave it without reservation, and it was the least lonely she had been in 3 years. The complication arrived in the form of a letter at the end of November, addressed to the Duke of Thornfield. Her father's title, which would now go to a distant male cousin she had never met, the dukedom passing along its proper line while the estate itself remained hers, forwarded by said cousin, with a brief note expressing his hope that the estate matter had been resolved satisfactorily. The letter was from the County Agricultural Board. It concerned the northern pasture land which abutted the estate belonging to the Rendell family, and a dispute about a boundary line that had apparently been in slow negotiation for 2 years without resolution. Theodora had not known about the northern pasture dispute. It was not in the accounts, not in the household records, not in anything Mr. Fenchurch had brought her. She had not known about it because Cassius Aldermere, who had been managing it, or not managing it, had not considered it relevant to disclose. She wrote to the county board. She wrote to the Rendell family solicitors. She went, on a cold Wednesday morning, to walk the northern boundary herself, with Haskell and a copy of the original survey map from 1847, which she had found in the estate records, and which was considerably more detailed than the current documentation suggested anyone had consulted recently. The Rendell land abutted the Thornfield northern pasture along a stretch of approximately half a mile. The boundary had been clear on the original survey. It had become less clear over the course of 20 years of a stone wall falling into disrepair on one side and not the other. This was not a legal problem. This was a maintenance problem, and therefore a communication problem, and therefore, Theodora suspected, a problem that had been allowed to become formal and official when it could have been resolved with a direct conversation 2 years ago. She wrote to the Rendell family directly, not through solicitors. She explained who she was, and that she had only recently taken possession of the estate, and that she had examined the 1847 survey, and that she believed the boundary was clear on documentation, and that what was needed was simply the restoration of the wall to its correct position, which she was prepared to undertake at Thornfield's expense as the party whose maintenance obligation had lapsed. She received a reply within 4 days. It came from Oliver Rendell, who introduced himself as the current holder of the Rendell property, recently returned from 3 years in the North, managing an inherited situation of his own, and who said that he had read her letter with considerable relief, as the solicitor correspondence had been costing money and producing nothing, and that the 1847 survey was exactly correct, and that if she was amenable, he would like to come and walk the boundary line with her directly and settle the matter as she had proposed. Theodora said yes. She set a date for a Thursday in early December. He arrived exactly on time, which she noted. He had come on horseback rather than by carriage, which she also noted, not because it signified anything in particular, but because she had made a habit of noticing everything and categorizing it accurately, rather than drawing conclusions before she had enough information. He was perhaps 32. He had the look of someone who spent considerable time outdoors and was not troubled by the fact that this was evident. He shook her hand without hesitation, which in 1887 was not the most common choice a man made when meeting a woman he had not been introduced to through formal channels, and said that he had brought the Rendell copy of the 1847 survey, in case they did not match, which they did perfectly at every reference point. They walked the northern boundary for an hour. He knew the land the way Haskell knew the Thornfield land, not from documents but from being in it, regularly, over time. He pointed out where the wall had stood originally, where the stones had been moved, and by whom, not accusatorially, but with the flat accuracy of someone who knows what happened and sees no reason to obscure it. She told him about the drainage situation in the East Quarter. She was not sure why she told him. It was not relevant to the boundary discussion. He asked questions about it, specific ones, about the soil composition and the elevation of the ditches, the kind of questions that suggested he had dealt with drainage problems himself. He mentioned a firm in the county that had done good work on the Rendell property. When they had walked the full length and agreed on every point, they stood at the northeast corner of the boundary and looked back across the Thornfield pasture. It was a clear day, cold and bright, the kind of winter day that makes distances sharper than they are in summer. The estate looked well from here, better than she had feared when she arrived. The gardens were maintained, the roof lines were sound, the Malloy cottage now among them. "You've been back only a month," Oliver Rendell said. It was not a question, but it invited a response. 6 weeks, Theodora said, though for the first 6 weeks I was here as someone else. He looked at her. She told him briefly. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that it was an unusual approach. "It was the only approach that would work," she said. "I needed to understand what I was walking into before I walked into it." "And did you?" "Better than I would have otherwise." She paused. "Though there are still things I didn't know. The northern boundary dispute was one of them." He smiled. It was a straightforward smile. She noted this, because she had spent 6 weeks surrounded by the particular managed smiles of people in a household under strain, and a straightforward smile was conspicuous by contrast. "I'm glad you wrote directly," he said. The solicitors were beginning to enjoy themselves. Theodora said she had suspected as much. They walked back to the house, and she offered tea, and he accepted without making it into a larger thing than it was. They sat in the library. She had been conducting most of her meetings in the library. It was the right room for that kind of thing, and drank tea and talked about the boundary wall and the drainage firm and the soil conditions in the north pasture. And at some point the conversation moved without any particular effort into other things. The estate board, the county agricultural matters, the question of the tenant cottage situation and how it had been handled elsewhere. He talked about his own 3 years away, managing an inherited property in the north that had been left in conditions requiring extensive work. He talked about it with the same flat precision he applied to everything, without drama but also without minimizing what it had actually involved. She found this. She searched for the word and found it: honest. The specific honesty of someone who has been through something genuinely difficult and describes it accurately rather than performing either suffering or fortitude. When he left an hour later, he said he hoped the wall matter would resolve quickly and that the drainage firm would serve her well. He said this without the particular register of a man who is looking for reasons to extend an acquaintance. He simply said it, the way a person says something they mean, and she found that she believed him. She went back to the library after his carriage had gone down the drive. On the desk, Mr. Fenchurch's papers waited. The East Pasture drainage tender needed her signature. The household accounts for December needed reviewing. The documentation for the codicil submission had to be finalized before Christmas. She sat down. She picked up her pen. Outside, the Thornfield grounds lay still and cold in the afternoon light. The apple trees in the kitchen garden, the ones that had been badly pruned at some point in the past 3 years and were not producing as they should, stood bare and patient. Haskell had told her last week that they were salvageable with proper attention in spring. He had said it in the tone of a person reporting a fact rather than offering consolation. She had found this, like so many things in the past weeks, more useful than any amount of reassurance would have been. The codicil was confirmed in January. Mr. Fenchurch sent word on a Thursday morning, in a letter that was 2 sentences long, which was exactly the appropriate length. Theodora read it at her desk. She set it down. She looked at the north wall of the library for a moment. Then she put on her coat and went out to the east quarter to check on the drainage progress, because the second phase was supposed to have begun Monday, and she wanted to see it for herself. Cassius Aldermere had left Thornfield 3 days before Christmas. The departure had been, in the end, unremarkable. He had taken his personal possessions and the items that were clearly his own. He had left the estate records in good order, which Theodora noted as a fact, without assigning excessive weight to it. He had left a note on the desk in the study, a brief one, formal, in his careful handwriting, that said the Malloy tenancy renewal was due in March, and that the east fence line would need attention before spring. She had written it into her notebook. Twice, in the weeks that followed, she had almost asked Mr. Fenchurch where Aldermere had gone. She had not asked because she did not need to know, and she knew she did not need to know, and the impulse to ask was simply the residue of a situation that was now resolved and could be allowed to settle. She thought sometimes about what he had said the night she had confronted him, that he had not expected her to be this. She had not asked what he meant. She thought she knew. She thought he had expected someone diminished, someone who had been away 3 years and had spent them in someone else's house, in someone else's city, waiting, which looked from the outside like the posture of a person who had given up. It had not been giving up. It had been waiting for the right kind of readiness. It had been learning Mr. Fenchurch's letters until she understood not just what they said, but what they meant. It had been corresponding with a retired estate manager her aunt knew, who had spent 2 months on paper teaching her things about agricultural land management. She had not been taught because no one had expected she would need to know them. It had been 3 years of understanding what she was going back to, so that when she went back, she would be equipped for it. It had not felt like any of those things from the inside. From the inside, it had felt like a long winter that refused to end. She thought about this sometimes. In the library at night, she thought about the person she had been at the beginning of those 3 years, 26 and furious and grieving and entirely without any map for the situation, and the person she was now, which was not harder or softer, but different, in the way that experience makes a person different, not changed but clarified, like water that has settled. Oliver Rendell came to walk the finished boundary line in February. The wall had been restored to its documented position, which pleased the county board and resolved the dispute entirely. He brought documentation from the agricultural board, and they signed things in the library, and then the business was done, and there was no particular reason for him to stay. He stayed for an hour. They talked about the north pasture drainage, which he had mentioned the firm for, and which had proven as reliable as he had said. They talked about the tenant situation in the east quarter, where the Malloy roof was holding through the winter, which she reported with satisfaction, and he received with the simple interest of a person who cares about whether roofs hold. They talked about the estate board meeting in March. Before he left, he said he had found the past month's correspondence. The letters about the boundary, the drainage firm recommendations, the county board matters, unusually direct. He said he meant this as a straightforwardly positive observation. People in these situations were often not direct. Theodora said she had found in the past several months that directness was more efficient than its alternatives. She had a certain amount of time and a considerable amount to do with it, and managing around indirectness was expensive. He looked at her with the particular attention she had noticed from the first day on the boundary line, which was not the managed attention of social performance, but the real thing, the attention of someone who is actually interested in what you're going to say. "Miss Vane," he said, "would you allow me to call on you properly? Not on boundary business, sometime in the coming weeks?" Theodora considered this. She considered it fully, without the reflex of either acceptance or deflection, in the way she had learned to consider things when they mattered. "Yes," she said, "I would. I should tell you, Mr. Rendell, that I have a great deal of work in front of me, and I am not easily distracted from it, and that anything that proceeds from a proper call must proceed honestly, with full understanding of my circumstances and priorities." "Those are exactly my terms as well," he said. He said it without drama, which was the only way it would have meant anything. She showed him to the door. She watched the carriage go down the drive in the thin February light. Then she went back to the library. The apple trees in the kitchen garden were still bare. Haskell had told her this week that the ones against the east wall would be the first to show signs of life in spring, and that with proper attention they would produce well. By autumn, she was looking forward to seeing it. She picked up her desk. She picked up her pen. There was the estate board meeting to prepare for, and the March tenancy renewals, and the ongoing drainage documentation, and a letter from the distant cousin who held the title and who had written to express, somewhat tentatively, that he was glad things were sorted out and hoped she was well. She had written back warmly and briefly, because he was not a bad person and none of this had been his fault. And she found she had no interest in carrying bitterness toward people who did not deserve it. It cost too much and produced nothing she needed. Outside, Thornfield Hall sat in its grounds in the winter afternoon, which were hers, unambiguously and permanently and without further contest, and which she intended to spend the next considerable number of years doing justice to. This was not what she had imagined at 19, when she had been the Duke's daughter, and life had seemed a matter of finding the right drawing room to sit in for the rest of it. It was harder than that, and smaller in some ways, and larger in others, and more completely and specifically her own than anything she had ever possessed. She began to write. She did not stop until the fire had burned low and Mrs. Crosby knocked on the door at 7 to say that supper was ready, in the composed and authoritative voice of a woman who has done this for 20 years and expects it to be heard. And Theodora said, "Thank you." She would be there in a moment, and meant it.